The winter of 1944 was brutal. Temperatures in the Ardennes forest dropped well below zero and the snow kept falling. American soldiers trudged through knee-deep drifts, their boots heavy, their breath creating small clouds in the freezing air. Most of the men in 2nd Platoon Charlie Company were just kids. Farm boys from Kansas and Wisconsin. Factory workers from Detroit. Young men who'd never been more than 50 miles from home before the war pulled them halfway across the world. Sergeant James Miller was different. At 32, he was older than most of his squad. Before the war, he'd been a high school history teacher in Ohio. Quiet, serious. The kind of man who paid attention to details. When the draft notice came, he didn't hesitate. He knew what was at stake. Around him, the forest was silent. Too silent. The kind of quiet that makes soldiers nervous. These men had been fighting in Europe for months, moving through France and Belgium. They'd seen things no young man should ever see, but nothing prepared them for what was about to happen. The squad was moving through a narrow valley surrounded by dense pine forests. Steep hills rose on both sides, creating natural choke points, perfect terrain for an ambush. None of them knew it yet, but they were about to become part of a story that would be almost forgotten by history. Private Tom Reynolds walked point, just 19 years old, from a small farm in Nebraska. He had sharp eyes and moved carefully, scanning the tree line. His M1 Garand rifle was clean and ready. To his left, Private Frank Garcia watched the opposite side of the valley, his hands steady despite the cold. They were part of the 106th Infantry Division. Green troops mostly. Many had only been in Europe a few months. They were replacing battle-hardened units that had been fighting since D-Day. No one had told them how dangerous their assignment would be. The German counteroffensive was already underway. What would become known as the Battle of the Bulge was about to begin. Thousands of German troops were massing, preparing to punch through American lines. This small valley would become one critical point in a massive battle. Sergeant Miller knew something wasn't right. He could feel it in his bones. The way the snow lay undisturbed, the absolute stillness of the forest. Something was waiting, something was watching. He signaled the squad to slow down, move carefully, keep tight formation, but it was already too late. The first shots came without warning, sudden, precise, from multiple directions. The valley erupted in gunfire and explosions. German machine guns had them perfectly zeroed in from hidden positions on the surrounding hills. In those first moments, everything happened fast, too fast for most of the men to even understand what was happening. The sharp crack of rifle fire, the deeper, heavier sound of machine guns, the sudden screams of wounded men. Private Reynolds went down first. A single shot caught him in the chest, spinning him backwards into the snow. Private Garcia tried to drag him to cover, but was cut down almost immediately. Within seconds, half the squad was wounded or dead. Sergeant Miller shouted commands, trying to organize a defense, but there was no defense. They were completely surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. The German units were professional, disciplined. They knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a planned, precise ambush, designed to eliminate an entire American squad. In just 9 minutes, what had been a 12-man squad was reduced to 4 surviving men. Wounded, trapped, with no hope of immediate rescue. This was war in its most brutal form, not the heroic charges you see in movies, not the clean, sanitized version of combat. This was raw survival. Random chance. The difference between life and death measured in seconds. Sergeant Miller pressed himself against a small rocky outcropping, blood seeping through a wound in his left shoulder. The cold was becoming more dangerous now than the bullets. His hands were going numb, jaws stiff around his rifle. The remaining 3 men were spread out, Private Thompson behind a fallen tree, Private Jenkins crouched near a small depression in the snow, and Miller himself wedged between rocks that offered minimal protection. They had no radio contact, no way to call for support, no way to signal their position. The German machine gun positions had fallen silent after the initial devastating assault. That was worse somehow. The silence meant they were planning something, stalking, hunting. Miller knew their options were limited. They couldn't retreat. The open valley offered no cover. They couldn't advance. The German positions were too well established, and they couldn't stay where they were immediately. Exposure would kill them just as surely as enemy fire. Private Thompson whispered across the snow, "Sergeant, we can't stay here." Miller knew that. But knowing and having a solution were two different things. The German tactics were brutally efficient. This wasn't just an ambush, this was a methodical elimination of an American reconnaissance unit. Every movement was calculated. Every shot precise. Jenkins suddenly tensed. His eyes caught something moving in the tree line, wall flicker of movement. Just for a moment. But Miller saw it too. Dark shapes. Careful. Deliberate. "They're coming," Miller muttered. The Germans wouldn't leave survivors. That wasn't their method. Not in these Alper desperate months of the war. Every American soldier represented a potential threat. Every squad a potential intelligence source. Miller checked his M1 Garand. 2 clips left. Maybe 8 rounds total. Thompson had less. Jenkins might have a full clip. But his hands were shaking badly from cold and shock. They had been part of the 106th Infantry Division's forward reconnaissance, young men thrust into a war they barely understood. Many hadn't even seen combat before this moment. Farm boys from Iowa and Nebraska, factory workers from Detroit and Pittsburgh, now reduced to 4 men fighting for survival in a snow-covered Belgian valley. The first German scout appeared between 2 pine trees, dressed in white camouflage nearly invisible against the snow. Miller saw him clearly, an experienced soldier, moving with the practiced precision of someone who had been fighting for years. One shot. That was all Miller would get. He steadied his breathing, controlled his trembling left hand, sighted down the rifle barrel. The German scout was less than 100 yards away now, moving slowly, scanning, searching. Miller knew if he missed, they were dead. Every muscle in his body was coiled like a spring. Years of training, months of preparation, countless hours on rifle ranges in basic training. All of it came down to this moment. One breath, one shot. The fate of 4 men hanging in the balance. In the distant hills, artillery began to rumble. The Battle of the Bulge was expanding. Thousands of men would die in the next few days. And right here, in this small, insignificant valley, 4 Americans were fighting their own private war of survival. Miller's jaw began to squeeze the trigger. The rifle cracked, the scout dropped instantly, a crimson stain spreading across his white camouflage. Miller worked the bolt without hesitation, ejecting the spent casing, but one shot meant they'd been revealed. Within seconds, German machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions. Bullets snapped and whined overhead, kicking up geysers of snow and frozen earth around their meager cover. Thompson, Jenkins, shift positions now. Miller shouted. They moved with practiced desperation, each man rolling and sliding, seeking whatever minimal protection the terrain offered. Thompson dove behind a half-buried boulder. Jenkins scrambled into a shallow ravine. Another scout appeared, then another. The Germans were methodically advancing, using classic infiltration tactics. No wasted movement, no unnecessary exposure. Miller knew they were being herded, pinned down, isolated. The artillery in the distant hills continued its thunderous percussion. The Battle of the Bulge was consuming everything: man, machines, entire landscapes. And here, in this tiny slice of Belgian wilderness, 4 American soldiers were fighting for survival against a precision killing machine. Jenkins fired 3 rapid shots, his hands still trembling. One German soldier went down, then another, but the cost was immediate. Less positions were now completely compromised. We need to break contact, Miller said, his eyes calm despite the chaos. Thompson, prepare a smoke grenade. Thompson nodded, pulling the olive-drab cylinder from his belt. One smooth motion, and white smoke began billowing across the snow, creating a temporary visual barrier. Miller knew the smoke wouldn't last long. The Germans were too experienced to be fooled for more than moments. They had to move. Now, Miller pointed toward a steep ridgeline to their east. Dense pine forest. Potential cover. Their only remaining option. We move in 30 seconds, he said. Jenkins, your point. Thompson, Cover our rear. I'll provide suppressing fire. No one argued. No one needed to. They were beyond words now, pure survival instinct. When Miller gave the signal, they moved with a choreographed precision born of weeks of training and hours of desperate necessity. Jenkins darted first, moving in short, controlled bursts. Thompson followed, his rifle sweeping their back trail. Miller provided covering fire, each shot deliberate and calculated. The German response was immediate and overwhelming. Machine gun fire raked the snowfield. Bullets chopped through pine branches. For 3 horrific minutes they were exposed. Vulnerable. Targets. Then suddenly, they crossed a critical threshold. The ridgeline offered protection. Dense trees. Uneven terrain. No clear line of sight for their pursuers. They weren't safe, but they were alive. Miller allowed himself one brief moment of assessment. Thompson had a graze wound on his left arm. Jenkins was breathing hard but seemed uninjured. Their ammunition was critically low, but they had survived. As darkness fell across the Belgian wilderness, 4 American soldiers melted into the forest. Behind them, the Battle of the Bulge continued its brutal symphony of destruction. Thousands would die in the coming days. But not them. Not today. The war would continue. But for Miller, Thompson, Jenkins and their unnamed 4th companion, survival was victory enough. Here is the continuation and completion of the script. Hours later, a frozen mist hung between the pine trees. Miller checked their map by moonlight, tracing potential routes back to Allied lines. Their compass was damaged, and their radio had been lost during the initial German assault. Thompson wrapped a makeshift bandage around his arm, the graze wound still seeping slightly. Jenkins sat quietly, his hands occasionally trembling, a remnetic from the earlier firefight. "We need to head southwest," Miller whispered. "If the coordinates are correct, we're about 12 kilometers from the 101st Airborne's current position." The unnamed 4th soldier, a young communications specialist named Roberts, had been silent since they escaped. His eyes carried a haunted look, reflecting the day's brutal encounters. Navigation would be treacherous. German patrols would be sweeping the region, looking for stragglers. Every movement could mean discovery. Every sound could be their last. Miller understood something fundamental in that moment. Survival wasn't just about skill, it was about maintaining composure when terror threatened to consume you. It was about making rational decisions when every instinct screamed to panic. They moved slowly through the forest, using techniques learned in training but perfected in real combat. Step carefully, listen continuously, watch every shadow, anticipate threats before they materialized. By dawn they had covered almost 6 kilometers. Exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on their shoulders. Roberts occasionally consulted a damaged map, triangulating their position using distant mountain silhouettes. A distant rumble made them freeze. Tank movement. German most likely, too close for comfort. Miller signaled a complete halt. They would wait. Patience could mean the difference between life and death. The tank passed perhaps 500 meters to their east, its tracks crushing frozen underbrush. Not a single member of their small group moved a muscle until the sound completely faded. When the ally resumed movement, the forest seemed to breathe with them, silent, watchful, a witness to their desperate journey. By midday they encountered a small farmhouse, abandoned, bullet-riddled, but potentially offering temporary shelter. Miller did a careful perimeter check before allowing the group inside. They would rest, recover, plan their next move. The war continued around them, but in this moment, they were 4 survivors. 4 men who had stared into the abyss of certain death and walked away. Their story was far from over, but they were alive.